This is why people get it wrong in predicting what's going to happen in the next year and so on. America's 50 states. And you got all these stories in many different cities and towns across these states. That means that Trump can't have it his own way just by ruling from Washington.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've got Professor Scott Lucas on the show from Clinton Institute, of course, University College Dublin, but we've got a special treat because he's actually in the studio today. Scott, crowd favourite for the Trump Report constituents, the viewers, the listeners, whatever you want to call them. Thank you so much for joining the show today.
Well, I had to see where the magic happens, man. So this is it.
And it's anticlimactic.
No. Look, I got you smile across the way. We've got two cameras today.
Money bags in the studio.
Exactly, and I got to see the great crew outside. I mean, that was absolutely superb.
I know, you're a star in these neck of the woods, but you and I spoke on Saturday, so it's great to kind of have the aftermath of the last day and a half, 2 days of what's kind of come on the back of that meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. So when we spoke on Saturday, our kind of takeaway from it was that it was a cordial meeting. Obviously, Zelensky didn't leave with exactly what he wanted out of this, which is, of course, the Tomahawks. But we felt like we were so far from this February ambush, and we were really onto something here. We didn't need a firm line from the United States, but we at least saw a cordial meeting between the two. Now, the Financial Times article is painting a different picture from what you and I left Saturday, of thinking what had happened, basically. So I'm just going to read out for our audience what this article says. So it says, the meeting between the US and Ukrainian presidents descended many times into a shouting match, with Trump cursing all the time. People familiar with the matter said they added that the US president tossed aside maps of the front line in Ukraine, insisted Zelensky surrender the entire Donbass region to Putin, and repeatedly echoed talking points the Russian leader had made in their call a day earlier. So, Scott, your reaction to this? This is a change of tune from when we spoke.
Yeah, and so let's walk it back, Maddie, to Friday, because I think I was looking at that wider picture where not only Zelensky, but the Ukrainian delegation had been speaking with, if you want to call it the adults in the room, or some of the adults in the room. They talked to some Trump people who are much more favorable to working with Ukraine. They were talking about financial arrangements. They're talking about support of Ukrainian reconstruction down the line. And Zelensky was also talking to defense contractors, about provision of American weapons, American equipment. And going into Friday, or coming out of Friday, Zelensky, of course, doesn't want to say it was an absolute nightmare. And so he glosses it in that, well, Tomahawks are still on the table, which I think they are, and I'll get to that in a minute. They're just not on the table right now because Trump has been spun by Putin. So I was kind of led that way with it, and I also was slightly misled by another thing, and here I've got to give Trump a little bit of credit. Because Trump said so many wacko things across the board on Friday. I mean, he was talking about Venezuela and how he was going to, covert operations are no longer covert. He was talking about the threat of the illegal aliens. He was talking about Democrats effectively being the Fourth Reich because he was worried about the No Kings protest. And I thought, okay, he's scrambled. He's not keeping focus here, which we've seen before. There were two revelations that come out. And what's going to be interesting is who leaked this. First of all, it came out in the Washington Post on Sunday, and then the Financial Times today. If you put the two together, what we find out is yes, indeed, Trump was focused. It wasn't just the Tomahawks and pushing back. You're not going to get the Tomahawks right now because I'm going to get a great peace settlement. You're not going to need the Tomahawks. It is this horrible, horrible line, which is, well, why don't you just give Vlad the rest of the Donetsk region? Why, Ukraine has 25% of the region. It's the heavily fortified area of the region. It is all the positions that you need to defend the rest of the country, including, as the Finnish President Alexander Stubb put it when he talked to Trump in August, the highway to Kyiv. And indeed, here's the link point. This is precisely where Zelensky and the Europeans on August 18th, 3 days after Trump had hosted Putin in Alaska, they had rolled this back. They rolled this back and said, no, you can't give Putin the rest of the Donbass, even if he says he will give up a little bit of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions in the south. And they were very successful about that. So we thought we'd move this along, and here we are 2 months later. So what's brought Trump even back to saying, well, maybe, look, I want my Nobel Peace Prize, just give him the rest of Donetsk. And it starts with Trump envoy and real estate developer Steve Witkoff. I thought Witkoff had been pushed to the nether regions of this issue, especially because he's been quite active in wherever we wind up on Israel-Gaza. And after his complete shambles of, for example, meeting with Vladimir Putin with not another member of the U.S. delegation and looking at his interpreter and going, wait, are you mine? Are you mine? And it turns out she wasn't. She was a Russian intelligence operative who interpreted for him. I thought, okay, they've exposed this guy, who's the bumbling fool that he is. But no, what happens is that Witkoff is in the meeting on Friday. And this comes out in the Washington Post revelation on it. And Witkoff is the one who's telling the Ukrainians in the meeting as Trump is there, oh, come on. Look, most of the people in the Donbass, which is the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions, they speak Russian. They speak Russian, so give them the territory, which I guess is the equivalent that all you folks in the UK should get the US back now because we speak some form of English, right? Vladimir Zelensky, by the way, just pub quiz question, his first language is Russian. He didn't speak Ukrainian until several years ago. So by Witkoff's logic, Zelensky should be sitting in the Kremlin right now. Anyway, so Witkoff is back in that room. Not Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, not Keith Kellogg, Trump's other envoy, who's a bit more sensible. It's Witkoff who's there. And, of course, Trump had spoken to Putin on Thursday. And I was focused on, you might not have been, you might have been sharper than I was focused on Putin pushing back on the Tomahawks because he's so worried about them. But quite clearly, Putin put it back into Trump's ear, which is, okay, here's a trade. Not really a trade. Give me Donetsk, and I'll withdraw from some areas.
Areas that they're not even occupying, really.
Yeah, down in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. And it's like, whereas Putin failed on the Alaska summit, which we discussed over the weekend, he overplayed his hand there. This time, at least for a few days, this is stuck. And of course, the Russians here, I think quite smartly, set the follow-up here, which is the follow-up is we'll get Trump to Budapest, which of course is Hungary, which of course is Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who's an ally of Putin, even if the country's within the EU. So they've got him on Putin's territory, or at least a far from neutral venue. So they're going to keep trying to run this. And so we're back to the place where Zelensky and Europe have to, again, start to work with others around Trump, start to work on pushing back on this. And I think two things are significant here. One is that on Friday, and we don't know, this is what the reports haven't come from, on Friday, either Zelensky or other Americans who were there pulled Trump back to, no, don't come out and say Putin should have Donetsk. Come out and say that the line should be frozen. In other words, Putin holds what he has, which is what Ukraine has effectively accepted already. So they pulled it back a bit on Friday. But the second thing to watch, I think, today is that already who leaked these stories that do not make Trump look very good.
Well, the part of the administration that's divided.
Exactly. It's
Scott, I know that we've said this before, but it keeps coming back to the exact same spot. I don't want to say square one because we're not at square one. But we keep going back to the same point where Donald Trump wants to do this in a diplomatic manner because he wants to be the deal maker. So you're right. He throws out these threats. He gets hard on Putin. Putin comes running back and says, okay, let's do a negotiation because he wants it to be through him, one-on-one, whether Viktor Orban's there, whether whoever else is there. He just wants to be the one that gets it done. So are we still at this place where Donald Trump is willing to concede certain things for Ukraine, willing to give up certain things just so he can kind of tie this into a neat bow so that he's solved this war?
We don't know because he spins like a weather vane.
Yeah.
We said this before. So let's put two things in addition to watch on this. Actually, let's start with the fundamental that you and I discussed over the weekend, which I think sticks, which is Trump doesn't want to be associated with a loser. Trump only wants to be associated with a winner. Now, first thing here is that Trump flipped on his perception of winning in that Friday conversation as well. over the weekend when he talked about it, actually, because he gave interviews to Fox TV. He had been saying that Russia's economy was going to collapse.
Yeah.
That was a huge shift, and he'd been saying that for several weeks. All of a sudden, he pops up on television this weekend and says, "Oh, no. Russia's in a good place economically. They're absolutely fine." And it's like,
he said they're doing great.
Yeah, right.
Last week, he said that the Russian economy was about to collapse.
Yeah. I mean, he's not exactly one for consistency, whether it be moral or in terms of intelligence. But that's, it was still quite a surprising turnaround. But that leads us to the second thing, which is, and it's why I'm not completely like, oh, this is it, Trump's back in Vlad's pocket, and it's that conditions change. And the thing that has changed here, which is quite significantly since the start of August, has been the Ukrainian attacks inside Russia. So I come back to you this morning, and what have I got? Ukraine overnight has hit yet another large oil refinery and set it ablaze. And they hit a second major installation as well down in southwest Russia. It was a gas plant, I should say. The gas plant they hit is right near the Kazakh border, Kazakhstan. It's one of Russia's main gas processing plants because it takes in, the supply from Kazakhstan and converts it. That's out of action now. And you could tell that story about a number of Russian refineries, including one that got hit for the fifth time since August, just a couple days ago. Now, if you continue to hit Russia like that, just with the drones, not with missiles, but with drones, you're changing the conditions. And does Trump go back and suddenly realize this again, that Russia is not, quote, winning? So that's a wild card. Does Putin, as he did in Alaska, misplay his advantage again by trying to grab too much? And then thirdly, how does Zelensky and Europe make their maneuvers? They're only starting to organize themselves. Zelensky talked to Macron yesterday, and just a general statement about needing to stand tall. Donald Tusk was quite active on social media about Europe needing to stand behind Ukraine, getting out front there. I think by the end of this week, you'll see Zelensky and Europe get back together, and they'll come back with a series of points they'll put back to the Americans, not just to Trump, but back to the administration.
How do you think how do you think Zelensky is dealing with Trump's unpredictability? We've seen such a stark contrast with the way that he interacts with Trump since February. He's obviously been taught how to walk the walk, how to talk the talk. He's talking Trump's language. We know from those two articles that behind closed doors, there were screaming matches. There was a lot of confusion over where they're at right now. But in public, in front of reporters, we're seeing Zelensky very cordial. He is not reacting to questions from reporters that would be deemed as insensitive to a country that's been invaded. He's not reacting to Donald Trump complimenting his jacket in a patronizing manner. He's not reacting to any of that. Even afterwards, when he doesn't get the tomahawks and he's speaking to reporters, he's still saying, we're still in a better place than what we were a few months ago. The tomahawks are still on the table. He is speaking in such a manner that he knows is not going to piss Trump off. So, I mean, even you mentioned this economy. We said, Trump said last week that they're about to collapse. This week he said that they're doing great. So, and then we saw only late last month him talking at the UN General Assembly. He's talking about how Ukraine can fight and win back their entire territory, how they're winning the war, how Putin is lying. How does Zelensky deal with this unpredictability? Or does he not rely so much on Donald Trump as he once may have thought that he was the keys?
Well, I think what's interesting is Zelensky's not only keeping his cool in public, I think he did it in private. Now, again, if you go through those stories, and there are others as well, but the big two are the Post and the Financial Times, they only refer to Trump losing his temper. So it's Trump who is cursing. And it is Trump who, when he's presented with the maps of the battlefield, pushes them away, says, I don't want to see these. I don't want to see this. There's no mention in those articles of Zelensky even raising his voice. Now, it may be those officials want to make Zelensky look good. I can't say that Zelensky didn't, but I think the message we're getting out of here is Zelensky just simply had to take this on the chin, come out, minimize the damage in the meeting, then went and spoke to the Europeans and briefed them. And then it was actually from the Europeans that we got the signal as to how bad things were, because they all came out and said, it's so important that we support Ukraine. It's so important we stand behind them. But as you mentioned, you then have the public appearances, and Zelensky is not bad-mouthing Trump, and he won't. I mean, we can go back to late February. Zelensky, who I still think kept his cool remarkably well given the onslaught that was there, but he tried to give too much information to J.D. Vance as well, because Vance wasn't interested in information. And then Trump. This time, Zelensky knows you just can't keep giving these folks information. You just come out and you regroup out of it. And again, we will see this over the next few days, because the thing about Trump is it's not just a case of that Trump could be all over the map on Ukraine. It's that Trump already, as you and I talk here, 3 days after the meeting, and Trump is absolutely infuriated about the No Kings protest over the weekend. He has got a problem, a real problem, with the ceasefire being under strain in Israel, Gaza. And he just simply, and I will say this, I'm going to put it down as a marker, because I have seen on social, and I have not gone there, so I'm just people saying Trump is not well. And I don't think Trump is completely well. I don't think he's going to break down. He's not going to die or whatever. But I think Trump is scrambled in many respects. And I think on Friday, he knew he wanted to get these points down on Ukraine and so on. But goodness knows where we are today, tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, which I'll come back to this. The more that Trump is scrambled, the more that he is all over, the more you have to go to other officials in a divided administration and say which one of those people are going to get the upper hand.
Well, I'm going to ask on that. You mentioned that Trump doesn't want the facts from Zelensky. He doesn't want the maps. Do we need to get Keith Kellogg back in the room?
Oh God, yeah. You need Kellogg there. I mean, we didn't see Kellogg.
But is he not working hard enough to show him, or is Trump not listening to him enough? Because I think we saw a bit of a change in tune from Trump.
Yeah.
Before the at the UN General Assembly, it was quite clear that the reason why he was using this rhetoric of Ukraine willing was because Keith Kellogg is the one saying, "Look, here are the facts. Ukraine is winning."
Yeah, but you know, as a journalist working down in Australia, working here in the UK, and then you watch the US, you know that in private, governments will have people who are scheming each other, who will always, on a day-to-day basis, trying to push themselves to the top of the food chain and to push others down it. And I think we can only speculate as to why Kellogg effectively went down the chain. Importantly, Scott Bessent has been occupied with China because that has not gone well with Trump suddenly declaring the 100% tariffs. Bessent had been one that I think had been talking about the need to provide support for Ukraine. He did meet the Ukrainian prime minister earlier in the week to talk about the recovery fund. But I think Witkoff also benefited from someone else. He may just be a real estate developer, and he may not be the sharpest tool in the box, but he had gotten his prominence back because of Israel and Gaza. All of a sudden, it was him and Donald Trump's son-in-law, the investment fund manager, Jared Kushner, who, because of another story I'll tell you later on, which involves Qatar, they're the two guys who suddenly are there to negotiate Trump's big so-called peace plan, which isn't really a peace plan, but I'll leave that for a moment. So they get the ceasefire. Trump goes out at the start of last week, a week ago today, and here he is in the Knesset, and there's Witkoff with Kushner and Ivanka, and so he said, look, this is my team, this is my team. Witkoff is back in good graces. He had really screwed things up on this, but because he gets the credit as much as Trump wants to dole out for Gaza, then he's back in the room on Ukraine, Russia at a time when Putin makes that phone call. It's just the convergence of that.
I want to read out a few things from this article. I read them out before, but I want to reiterate this point. He said that in the Financial Times, people familiar with the matter, they said that they added that the US president tossed aside maps, as we mentioned, of the front line in Ukraine, insisting Zelensky surrender the entire Donbass region to Putin. Just for our audience, just for clarification of what this is, Donbass is, of course, Donetsk and Luhansk. As it stands, Russia occupies 88% of the Donbass region. 75% of Donetsk is, of course, the area that he wants, and practically all of Luhansk. So Trump was then asked on Sunday about this. A reporter said, did you tell Zelensky he needed to concede all of the Donbass region to Russia? Trump said, no, we never discussed it. We think that they should do is just stop at the lines where they are. The reporter says, what do you think should happen with the Donbass region? He said, I think 78% of the land is already taken by Russia, which he probably means 88. You leave it the way it is right now. Is that not Trump saying, for Ukraine to concede the land? Because you and I were a bit
No,
or about whether that's what he meant on.
No, I think he pulls it back a bit. I think this actually means Ukraine pulled it back from how bad it was. I read the 78% as being he meant to say 78% of Donetsk.
Right.
And it's around
75.
It's around 75. Now, where did Trump get that number from? And again, Witkoff could have given it to him. The other person who I should add in the mix is JD. JD's back. Good old hillbilly elegy JD Vance, because JD is fighting number of fronts now to prove he's the solid guy. And so JD on Sunday tipped something off that I'll add to this, then I'll get back to it. He's doing the rounds of interviews as well. And JD said about the Tomahawks, he said, well, the president's going to have to decide. It's up to the president. But then JD said, but, we really need him for our stocks. Now, that's the kicker line that tells you where JD is. That's a line Trump also used on Friday. We should get these. We should keep these. But remember the other area that comes from. There are certain Pentagon officials, Elbridge Colby, who've been trying to cut all aid to Ukraine by saying, we need these stocks. We need these stocks.
He said that we've done an audit and we need them.
We need them, right? That was back in May when he got Defense Secretary Hegseth to freeze aid for just a brief period of time. So you got Witkoff, you've got officials like Colby, you've got Vance that are there. This is where you go, like, you just try to find a glimmer of all this. Despite all of this, what Trump did not do is come back and say, in those interviews over the weekend, he should have 100% of the Donbass. So all of Luhansk, which Putin already has, all of Donetsk. So he came back off that line. That gives the space for Ukraine and Europe, as they did in August, to hold him to that. Because again, and some of our Ukrainian comrades don't like it, and I understand why. But you and I have discussed for months that the landing point probably for this is that land that the Russians occupy. They're going to keep 75% of Donetsk for the near future.
Do you think, sorry to interrupt, do you think Zelensky is actually getting to a place where he's willing to drop weapons, where they are willing to let Putin occupy what he has?
He's been willing for months,
knowing that he's probably going to circle back to this in a few years.
He's been willing for months to freeze the lines effectively, and I should explain why. If you go back, probably just after Trump took office, or maybe even just at the tail end of the Biden administration. And I knew this from contacts as well in Ukraine, that they were going to this. Zelensky starts putting more focus on the security guarantees from the West. And so what do those security guarantees mean? Economically, it means path to the European Union. Militarily, it means at the very least an association with NATO. He'd like NATO membership. He may not be able to get that, but he'd like to be associated with NATO.
Would he? Is there any chance he could just get Article 5?
He could get the equivalent of Article 5. And people say, oh, you can't do that. That commits the Americans. The Americans just gave an Article 5 or an Article 5 light to Qatar because of Israel's miscalculation. So if you can hand it out to Qatar just like that, the Americans can work with NATO to give an Article 5 guarantee, which means if Russia was to break a settlement and attack again, then other countries would be obliged to come to the aid of Ukraine, not necessarily with boots on the ground, but with a much more significant commitment to aid on the ground, aid on the air defenses, rather than the step-by-step process that we've had since 2022.
Will he, if say Zelensky, this is kind of the compromise that he has to make, because he knows that if I'm going to read out actually the quote, but who said this? Let me find it. Oh, yes. The chair of Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee told the Financial Times in that article, it's not about getting more territory for Russia. It's about how to destroy us from within. Yeah. So that's, of course, why he's skeptical about letting any land remain in Russian occupation. But it's the compromise he's willing to make, because is Zelensky preparing for 3-4 years, Trump's out of office, Russia rearms, the economy gets going? Is he preparing for the fact that they're already within Ukraine now? They're in a better place than they were in 2022, so they'll probably attack again. But if he has these security guarantees from NATO, as you say, it's unlikely that they will be in the vulnerable position that they have been in.
Yeah, I think Zelensky and many other Ukrainians, and I would add, for example, I look forward to you getting an interview with the current Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, who is the former chief of staff.
He'd be willing to come on the show.
And Mr. Zelensky, right? Because I think he could explain this. And let me preface that by saying, from a military point of view, for me, the one thing that has changed here, which means that you have to look at freezing those lines, this is the first war of the drone. This is now a conflict where you've seen that you cannot overrun vast swathes of territory using tanks and even vast amounts of manpower, which has meant the Russians have not been able to sweep through after their initial setback in 22. But Ukraine could not counterattack in 23 because both sides underestimated how much the drones pin their forces down. So that's what you're facing here. And I think the calculation, because I said it went beyond Trump, is this. Russia does not necessarily win by occupying territory. Because what's the type of territory it has? Okay, it's got Crimea, which I think is a fairly important position. It's had it since 2014. And that's very, very strategic. But you look at those areas that it has gained in the east and the south since 22, they've leveled those areas. Those areas in many respects are not fit for habitation. They've made a token show of some areas of Mariupol, which they took in 2022, that they've rebuilt. But it's not really a functioning city. The areas of Donetsk that they've taken, beyond what they held since 2014, because they supported the separatists in 2014, that's raised earth. That's scorched earth tactics. Now, the Russians are going to have to put money in there to rebuild it, or it's going to be an anchor on them. Meanwhile, what does Ukraine do? If Ukraine has got the support of not just the U.S., but European community, international community, to build up its economy, to build up its industries, including its defense industry, if Ukraine gets a path to the European Union, can meet all the criteria for that, then what you have is the remaining 80% that is not occupied by Russia all of a sudden does not become like this crippled, hindered Ukraine that's held back. It becomes a Ukraine which goes back on the up. And again, some of our commenters don't like the analogy and understand why, and it is a very, very loose analogy, but it is still striking for me. You could go back to 1948 in the first years of the Cold War, and people would say, Germany's been lost to the Soviets. All right? They've got East Germany as effectively their client state. Berlin is inside East Germany, although part of it is West Berlin. They've really taken this over. And U.S. and European policymakers at that point said, okay, we're not going to get East Germany back. We're not going to liberate East Germany. What are we going to do? We're going to help West Germany build itself up, which is precisely what happened for decades. West Germany became one of the biggest economic powers on the planet, right? It was not this dead weight that was just continued to be crippled by World War II and by the Cold War. It became a key player in NATO. Now, it did not become unified for 40 years. And I think that's a big question for Ukrainians if you were going to take on that analogy. I don't think they'd want to wait 40 years. But I think the analogy of building up those areas of Ukraine, which is not just for recovery, but for an advance, that's where we wind up if we get a freezing of the front lines.
There'd been a lot of commentary on the importance of the Donbass, but I wonder if it matters anymore, because before the war, it was the industrial hub of Ukraine. I think 90% of coal is in the area, produces steel, coal, machinery. It's rich in minerals. 90% of coal reserves are in this area, iron ore, rock salt, some oil and gas. So, it's literally been called the industrial powerhouse of Ukraine. That's hard for them to give up. But does it matter if they're not running it the way it could be?
Yeah, it matters because, first of all, if they don't give up that 25%, that's some of where the minerals are. That's some of where where the coal is in some of those areas. And even though some of those areas have been badly damaged by the Russians and so on, you could, if the lines freeze, you could start to rebuild, which takes place. But more importantly, it's go and have a look at that map. If you let Russia advance in Donetsk, you give them that launch pad to try to strike further up to the northeast. And we know that they've been trying to attack in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions for months. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city. You don't want to put those areas at risk. You can come down from Donetsk and go down towards Zaporizhia, right, which Russia already occupies part of. So the Russians could put further pressure on Zaporizhia and go through there. In other words, it's a significant advanced position that the Russians take up, which is that, and this is what it comes back to. This is why Witkoff continues to be a hapless envoy and why Donald Trump doesn't know about Ukraine. The Kremlin's goals are still to, at the very least, put in a puppet government, which is their government that they control, and to effectively, through that government, control every area of Ukraine. So Alexander Stubb, who plays golf with Trump, so hopefully he'll have another golf round to tell him this again. This gives them the ability to move back on Kiev when they had failed in 22, and it gives them that ability to sweep down to the south and try to sweep across to Odessa, which they really want, because, of course, it's the biggest port city on the Black Sea.
Yeah.
So, and that, I think, again, will take us where we'll get to the sticking point sooner rather than later. If Putin was to freeze the front lines, he gives up on those ambitions.
So he said no. So here's what's happened in the last few hours. Moscow has dismissed the proposal from Donald Trump for the conflict to be frozen on the front lines. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, he said that the Russian Federation's negotiating position regarding freezing the war at the line of contact remains unchanged. So Trump still says that Russia wants peace, wants the war to end. But then you have things like this, where they'd be given Ukrainian land, or they've already got a lot of it, but they'd be essentially given it without fight. So I don't really know what we're going to get out of the Budapest summit.
I marvel at the Kremlin. There's one of the best social media accounts you can watch, and he's on multiple platforms, is Darth Putin. And Darth Putin, who's even got a book out now, which I highly recommend, out of all of his tweets. Well, he always say, I am the master strategist. And I marvel at the fact that Putin, who is vicious, who is aggressive, who fights for the kill, I just marvel at the fact he doesn't do certain things that you would think. You would think that Moscow would just back it off for a few days until Budapest.
Yeah.
And ding, 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 Kremlin bingo. If they come out with that phrase, root causes of the conflict, which is their code for everything we want to say is awful about Ukraine, why we have to conquer it. Root causes, they're Nazis. Root causes, they're fascists. Root causes, they oppress Russian speakers, right? Okay, pop, pop. It's like, you have to realize, Kremlin boys, that Trump does not put the priority, as awful as Trump is as a negotiator, as bizarre and chaotic as is, he's not putting the priority on Russia getting more territory. His priority when he told that to Zelensky on Friday was, well, actually, let me walk this back a bit. Let me just bring this all to link up together. When Trump flipped over the past few weeks, part of the reason why he flipped on Putin, Russia is collapsing economically and so on, was to try to bully Putin into saying, okay, I'm going to stop and hold what I have. He was trying to bully Putin, and Putin doesn't take it in the end. What he's doing on Friday is he's trying to bully Zelensky. He's trying to bully Zelensky into it. And by the end of the meeting, he's already pulled back a bit on the bullying, right? Moscow, if it continues to do this and says, no, we have to have this territory and so on, they're going to open up that space for Zelensky and the Europeans again to go through people like Keith Kellogg and others to say, no, he's not going to stop. I do think that the one thing I missed, and, I missed quite a bit, but this was the one I missed last week, was Witkoff. I can't believe that man was back in the room. And it was the combination of him plus Putin on Thursday that gave the Kremlin its edge. Now, here we are. Dmitry Peskov is giving that edge back up. And, if Dmitry Medvedev comes out of the vodka closet, then you're going to see further problems. So, again, it's like another week, and you're saying, quote, we're back to square one. But I think if you want to round this off, we're not at square one. And I just have to have a quick reminder, just two things. It still comes back to this. Look, square one back in 2022 was the Russians were going to overrun all of Ukraine within a few weeks. Didn't happen. square one, start of this year, was the Americans were going to bail on Ukraine. No more assistance of any kind, no more support. It would be up to the Europeans alone. Well, the Americans are still providing military aid to Ukraine, albeit selling it, despite what Trump said on Friday. They are linked in with Ukraine on reconstruction recovery, albeit through the rare earth minerals deal as the vehicle. That's in there. And they have not completely pushed Zelensky and Europeans away from the table for direct U.S.-Russian talks.
Exactly. So there's a lot to be optimistic about, and I mean, you and I can't predict so much about what will happen at this upcoming summit, but we just hope that he can somewhat stay on the side of Ukraine. But Scott, I want to end on a more of a domestic level. The No Kings protest you mentioned at the start of the interview, it was held across the United States over the weekend, where protesters were rallying against Donald Trump and what organizers describe as against his authoritarian regime. So over the weekend, organizers claimed that there were nearly 7 million attendees across roughly 2,600 or 2,700 events across the country. So what was your response to these protests? When you have 7 million people across the country, it's obviously a large population in the US. Does it make an impact?
Yeah, it makes an impact. Even in Trump world, it makes an impact. I mean, first off, if you want to know it makes an impact, and we'll talk about it in a minute, look how defensive Trump world was, beginning with Trump. But more importantly, despite all the efforts by this administration to effectively not just curb dissent, but to make it a criminal activity, despite all the attempts by the administration to take away rights, to break the American system itself, those folks turned out. You know, there were no King's protests earlier this year as well. I do know a couple of the organizers of them. And this time, it wasn't just that they got a few 100,000. It wasn't just that they got up to 7 million. That's about 1 in every 50 Americans, 2% of the population that turn out. So
that's nearly the entire population of New South Wales.
Yeah, it's about twice the size of my home state. Twice the size of my home state of Alabama. And even in Alabama, they had people turn out, which is something. And in fact, I'll tell you a story in a minute, which will tell you how significant it was, which will bring it back to some of my relatives and in Florida. So the fact is that people did come out. And then the other thing was the way that they came out, right? All week long, the Trump people were trying to egg this on for violence. I mean, just awful statements. It got to the point where Caroline Leavitt, who is running to become like America's first lady president already, it's like the entire Democratic Party, what was it they consist of? They consist of terrorists, illegal aliens, and Hamas sympathizers. And I thought, okay, every Democrat, that's exactly where you're going to go with that. And then you had Mike Johnson, who should, instead of doing his job as the House Speaker, because he shut the House down, is coming out talking about how the evil George Soros is paying everybody to come out there. And so they're all ranting and raving. And what they were doing is they were trying to stoke it up where they would get violence. They didn't. There were 7 million on the streets. There were 0 reported arrests of No Kings protesters. There were 22 arrests, but they were of Trump supporters who came out in counter-protests. And they came out in the inflatables, which you're beginning to see, which started with the Portland Frog. And, you know, you had the Pikachus, and you had the unicorns, and you had the antelopes, and you had all this. And it was a playful environment. And I'm not quite old enough, thank goodness, not quite there yet. But the nostalgic part of the 60s, before it all goes really pear-shaped in the 60s, of when people came out in the 60s and came out after the system in that way of trying to celebrate joy and trying to celebrate a sense of community. And that's what you had on the upside. Now, on the downside was going to be the Trumpist reaction to it, which is... Just
for our audience, I'll read it out, that Trump, he posted an AI video of him depicted as King Trump seated in the cockpit of a fighter jet where he drops what appears to be feces all over these protesters. So, I mean, while Danger Zone is playing in the background. So your reaction, Scott, to that, was Trump pissed off? Did this offend him?
God, yeah. He's really, really pissed off. I mean, he wasn't just pissed off with this AI, which I'll get to in a minute. He was pissed off when he was talking to reporters on Air Force One, coming back from Florida, and he was upset that this show of what was defiance, but a defiance that he couldn't turn it into chaos and destruction and streets were burning. But it was more than being pissed off. You know, I said earlier I didn't think Trump was quite right. I don't think the entire White House is quite right. So I do want to get into that AI video without getting too specific about it, because one of the awful things that I saw on there is that here you have a man who had gone into the weekend telling Fox TV, I'm not a king. I'm not a king. I'm not a king. How can I be a no kings protest? I'm not a king. I'm not a king. And then he puts himself in a king's ground, which he has done repeatedly. He's like, okay, that's the first thing. And then the man who had bone spurs in his feet, never went to Vietnam, here he is, I'm a military tough guy. Look, I'm Top Gun guy. So like this really dystopian version of Tom Cruise now in his jet. And then it was dropping pieces. And a couple of those images of people he dropped it on, they are identifiable. They're actually prominent internet activists, on YouTube, on Insta. And it just showed the combination of a man baby who happens to be president of the United States. But it doesn't stop there, because there was something that came out from the official White House account, not Trump, the official White House account. It's two images. The one on the bottom is one of the notorious AI images now, which is the two leading Democrats in Congress, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. It's from the government shutdown, but it's the one which is the racist imagery of Hakeem Jeffries with the Mexican mustache and wearing the sombrero. The image above that is Trump and J.D. Vance in royal regalia wearing crowns. And the White House effectively saying, take your pick. Well, I know which side I picked, and it wasn't the one they would want, right? It's not actually the monarchs. So the reason why I say they were on the defensive unsettled is it wasn't even consistent trolling. If it was trolling, you should play down the effect that Trump was this king who feels threatened. They did exactly the opposite. And the government is still shut down. So
you say that, Scott. I think that the louder message from Trump actually would have been silence.
Yeah, it would have. So now I get to the personal story, which tells you why. I'm not saying by all of this means that No Kings has turned the corner. I do think that a lot of people who are going saying, the Democrats are dead in the water, they're still out. That's just been ridiculous. And we'll talk about where that goes when we have the 2026 elections. The personal story is this. I got called up by a close friend, right, in Florida. And this friend is a devout Trumpist. And just was chatting away until I said, we were just chatting about other stuff. And then this friend said, did you go to a No Kings protest? And I said, well, no, because here in Ireland, we got rid of our king 100 years ago, right? Which, of course, was the British monarch. And he says, oh, no. I said, did you have one in Tarpon Springs? Now, Tarpon Springs is a little town in Florida on the Gulf, home of one of the largest sponge fishing communities in America and one of the largest Greek communities in America. Fun fact. And this friend, to my surprise, said, oh, yeah, we did.
Oh.
We have one in Tarpon Springs. They were gathered on, one of the corners in Tarpon Springs. I said, oh, did you wave? Did you honk the horn? You wave? He goes, no, no, I didn't wave. I was like, so even Tarpon Springs, right, had these folks turn it out. In Florida, of course, is by and large a Republican state.
Yeah.
And even my patch of the woods where I grew up in Alabama, which is very, very deep red, people are turning out because this is where I will, got to watch at the door. They're telling us that my time here is about to end. What encouraged me about the No Kings protest is that at some point you've got to get beyond the polarization of all of this. I don't care. I'm not a big fan of Trump. But this is bigger than Donald Trump. I mean, this is a question of going beyond Democrats, going beyond Republicans. It's beyond right and left. You're talking about a society which is really, really damaged. It is damaged because people just have been dissuaded from, or they're told if they try to work together and make things better, that's it. You've got to go into your camps and you've got to fight. And what you saw with No Kings is you did see signs that we're not happy with Trump. But what you actually saw is you saw people turning out and say, we really want our communities to actually be ours again, right? We want it to be ours again. they don't want a Democrat to play at being an autocrat. They don't want a Republican playing an autocrat. And they damn sure don't want Trump playing at being an autocrat. And I think if you can extend that conversation in a productive way beyond the protest at the grassroots level, because this is why people get it wrong in predicting what's going to happen in the next year and so on. America's 50 states. And you got all these stories in many different cities and towns across these states. That means that Trump can't have it his own way just by ruling from Washington.